Hello, and welcome to our discussion on effective communication. So just a formal definition of communication in the top bullet point here, and just pointing out that because as managers we get most of our work done through other people, a vast majority of the manager's time is spent communicating. And if you're good at it, it can help you get a job, it can help you make your employees more satisfied, and overall can be important to the company's market value. However, when miscommunication happens, it can be very expensive. Obviously, accidents are often caused by miscommunication. Lawsuits, the interesting thing is that research has been done on malpractice lawsuits, and the primary influence on whether or not a patient decides to bring a suit against a doctor, it's less often about the harm that was caused to the patient, and more often the patient feels frustrated or upset about the doctor's communication style. And then lower productivity is very common with poor communication. So we try to avoid miscommunication, and let's break down this communication process. So the idea is that you have a source of some kind of a communication. So this is a person who decides they want to communicate something. They encode that communication most of the time through written or spoken language, and then they send that communication to the receiver through a channel. So whatever that message is, it goes through a particular channel. The receiver then decodes, sometimes inaccurately, the message, and then may give the sender, the source, feedback. So I like to think of the sender as the person who's originating the message with a thought. And then they encode the message, translating it into words, gestures, body language, etc. And then the receiver decodes the message by assigning meaning to the words. It might not always be the exact same meaning that the sender meant. And then the receiver receives the message, hopefully gives the sender some feedback by responding to the message. And you'll notice that there is this thing called noise, which is anything that interferes with or distorts the message that's being transferred. So you could say at the end of all this discussion, this slide has become very noisy. So here's a thought exercise that I'd like you to do. On the next several slides, I describe a number of different scenarios. Please read through each scenario, identify where in the communication process you believe that communication broke down, and then describe what could have improved the communication outcome. What could the communicators have done differently? Okay, so there's room for interpretation on all of these so-called answers. When I wrote the examples, these are the places in the communication process that I was aiming to identify. So when you're talking about Ron and Rhonda, where Ron expressed his feelings to Rhonda and she let him know that she only saw him as a friend, what you're really talking about is Ron's reaction to Rhonda's feedback. So you could say that he didn't like or was unhappy about the feedback that he received about his message. In the Millie and Zed situation, where Millie decided to break up with Zed on the way to her house, like 3 hours away or something like that, what you're talking about is that Millie chose an inappropriate channel. The channel, don't forget, doesn't just include the way that we decide to communicate it, which Millie decided to do it face-to-face, but it's also the environment and the situation in which we decide to communicate it. And deciding to communicate to Zed that she wanted to break up when she was 4 hours away from her home was probably not the brightest idea. Talking about Kevin and Ron, Kevin has a crush on Ron's wife. And I would argue that deciding to communicate the message at all is where the communication broke down. I don't see how Ron could have ever expected, or sorry, Kevin could ever have expected Ron to respond positively to that message. That's something you keep to yourself. And then finally, John and his boss, the communication broke down in John's encoding of the message. John meant to tell his boss that he was really committed to the company and was looking forward to building his career there, and his boss heard something completely different because of the way John encoded the message. So when we talk about communication channels, there are many options for the channel that we'll use to get our communication across. One is oral, just a verbal communication, can be one-on-one, can be with a group. Two is written, with the written word, so reports, memos, and letters. And by written, we're meaning the more formal, actual paper, letters, reports, and memos, because all other written communication goes through electronic. So it could be email, it could be chat, it could be text, it could be Slack, lots of different ways to send electronic communications. And then finally, we have nonverbal communication, which when we're having a verbal face-to-face conversation, we're also giving cues to the other person, consciously or unconsciously. So there's some pros and cons for each kind of communication channel. So oral communication is instantaneous and you can get feedback immediately as you're talking to somebody. But one of the cons is that people might not remember everything that was said in the conversation. Written communication, you can keep a record of it, you can review it, you can archive it and refer back to it in the future. But the cons is that the sender doesn't really always get feedback from the receiver. So you might not be aware of how your message was received. Electronic communications helps you to reach a large audience quickly, so that's a major pro. But for cons, there's many possibilities. We all know that there's tech problems, that security breaches are not uncommon, and that misinterpretation can be easily misconstrued. And then finally, nonverbal communication, those body cues, those body language and other cues can communicate subtle messages, but we're not always conscious of the message that we're sending. So another thing to think about with communication channels is the channel richness, like how much information gets across through the channel. And it's probably not surprising for you to hear that the best channel richness are face-to-face conversations, because not only do you get to hear the words, but you also see the facial expressions, you can listen to the tone of voice, you can watch the body language and the gestures, so you can learn a whole lot more than just the words are telling you. Lowest channel richness, not surprisingly, are memos and letters or formal reports where the sender has no way to see how the receiver is receiving the message, and the receiver has no way to learn anything from the sender except for from the words themselves. So not surprisingly, if you have a tough conversation that you have to have, it's probably better to use a channel that has high channel richness. And for routine messages, maybe low channel richness is okay. Just keep it simple and send out that message. So selecting the appropriate channel is really important here. If you, we already said non-routine messages, it's better to be along rich channels. If you have to deliver an emotional message, definitely deliver it in person. You don't want to be that person that breaks up with somebody via a text. Same thing at work. You don't want to be the person that tells somebody bad news about their performance via an email. And then it's better not to waste the time on routine messages with face-to-face. Just send those things via an email. You know, if it doesn't require feedback, just keep it simple. And also consider the receiver. Different folks have different preferences. And if you know the person well, you might want to, especially if it's your boss, communicate with them along the channel that they prefer. So communication doesn't always go smoothly. Some of the common barriers to communication are filters. So if somebody purposely screens and then manipulates the message, and we've got Iago whispering in Othello's ear, so perfect example of a filter. Emotions. I put a Game of Thrones reference here. I am totally ignorant of Game of Thrones, so I can't even remember the name of this character, but she's obviously showing that she's quite angry. And we often don't communicate as well when we're under the influence of a strong emotion. Information overload, many of us feel like this a lot of the time. There's so much to keep track of. It makes it hard to prioritize and figure out what needs to be done next. And then differing perceptions. This is a cultural difference that I'm showing in the picture here. We have a Western woman reaching out to shake the hand of an Eastern man who, for him, it's more appropriate to bow when you meet somebody new. So just remembering that there are differences out there, not just cultural differences, but all kinds of differences about the way people perceive situations. So one of the things that we can do to help improve communication is to use the active listening process. You've probably heard of this already, but I still want to go over it because I think it's really important to give it a try. So when you're using active listening, you're consciously sensing. So you're receiving both the verbal and the nonverbal cues consciously. You're paying attention. You're not just letting your subconscious take over. So don't interrupt the person. Let them finish what they're saying and make sure that you're absorbing as much as you possibly can. And then when you respond, you're giving them some feedback back. Then when you're processing, then you reply back to show that you're understanding what they have to say. So you might ask a question to clarify, or you might show that you understand by just saying, oh yeah, I get what you're saying. Something like that, just to show that you're actively listening. And then when you respond, you give them some feedback and maybe you clarify your response to their message. So this chart is kind of nice because it shows how communication happens in a number of different directions within most organizations. You've got two-way communication in a lot of instances, downward and upward communication going on between the different hierarchical levels, and a lot of lateral communication between folks at the same level in the organization. So leaders of the organization use downward communication to send messages to the lower levels in the hierarchy, whereas upward communication is taking messages from the lower levels to the higher levels, and lateral communication is where people at the same hierarchical level are communicating with each other. Okay, so in the Change the Way You Persuade article, the article suggested that you should base your persuasive arguments on the decision-making style of your listener. And the article suggested that there were 5 broad decision-making styles: the charismatic decision maker, the thinker, the skeptic, the follower, and the controller. So I've provided an example of a celebrity figure who epitomizes each decision-making style described in the article, and a little bit of information about what you, as the persuader, need to focus on to win each of these different kinds of styles over to your idea. So for the charismatic, like Richard Branson, you want to focus on results, make sure your arguments are simple and straightforward, and use lots of visual aids. For the thinker, like Katharine Graham, the editor of the Washington Post during the Watergate scandal, you want to have lots of data ready and present all sides of the situation. For the skeptic, Tom Siebel, the chairman of the Internet of Things, you want to make sure that you have credibility. You want to have somebody vouch for you, somebody that the skeptic believes in. And then for the follower, for example, Carly Fiorini, you want to make sure that you have lots of references and testimonials and show that this path will be a path to success. Finally, the controller, for example, Martha Stewart, you want to make structured, credible arguments and give them the information and allow them to convince themselves. The controller is never going to want to feel like you've convinced them. This is just a cute little video about some of the differences in communication that often fall along gender differences. So if you give it a little watch, you might find some interesting things that you might have run across in work. There are also cultural differences in communication. We already talked about the one where when you meet a new person, Western cultures often shake hands, whereas Eastern cultures often bow. There's a broad way to think about cultural differences in communication, and that is this idea of low context versus high context. For those of us that live in English and German speaking cultures, we are more often low context communicators. So we like our messages to be explicit. We like the words to mean what they, say and say what they mean. And we're very efficient, fast, direct, logical, etc. So sometimes when we go and try to communicate in a high context culture, it can be a little challenging for us. So Asian and Middle Eastern cultures are much more likely to be high context communicators, in which there's a whole bunch more information coming across through body language and nonverbal cues. The circumstances that the communication is happening within can really affect the interpretation of the words. And the communication style, instead of being direct, logical, and efficient, is indirect and very intuitive and contemplative and very passive, which can be hard for those of us in a low context culture to even realize. When somebody in a high context culture is giving us negative feedback, we might not even know it because they're pretty indirect about it. Some other things to think about when you think about cultural differences in communication is posture, and the way that you stand and the way that you hold your arms and cross your legs and things like that can matter. Facial expression. Certain cultures show a whole lot more expression on their face than others. Eye contact. I know that as a kid raised in the United States, I don't know how many times I heard, look somebody in the eye when you're talking to them. But in many cultures, looking superior directly in the eye is considered to be rude and forward. Touch. Some cultures are much more comfortable with touching somebody, shaking their hand than others. And gestures. And just for fun, here's some examples of gestures that mean something completely different in North America than what they mean in other cultures. So being aware of these differences is, can be kind of fun. So one thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about cultural differences, and I'm assuming that many of you are going to go on to work in businesses where you spend at least some of your time in other cultures, is that we're all marked. Every single culture in the world is marked by a little bit of this idea of ethnocentrism, which is basically, because we've grown up in it and because it's familiar to us, we tend to think that our culture is better than everybody else's, right? Or that other cultures are weird or strange, right? And so I love this quote from David Sedaris because he points out that Americans think that our culture is the best and our country is the greatest, but most other countries have some nationalistic slogans of their own, none of which are "we're number two." So just keeping in mind that other cultures have just as strong beliefs that theirs is the best as we tend to have about ours. One way to kind of challenge our assumptions is to think about what would happen if the map were shown with the South on the top instead of the North, and how strange it looks to those of us who are used to looking at a map that's oriented the other way. And I've got another cute video here that talks about how the map that we assume is a factual piece of evidence is actually still based on our cultural assumptions as well. So just kind of realizing that other people might look at the world a different way, And it's okay if theirs isn't the same way as yours. And being flexible and able to navigate other cultures can be very good for you in your career. So when you're preparing for a trip that's going to take you to another culture, here's some suggestions to help you be successful. Number one, do your homework. So get familiar with the customs before you go. If there are folks in your business who have been to the other country before, they can give you some pointers. You can, I'm sure, find a whole bunch of stuff on Google too about, what are the customs in particular cultures, and just kind of get a little bit of groundwork laid ahead of time. Number two, don't make assumptions. So watch everybody around you and be conscious about matching your actions to the actions of others. So if your new colleague bows towards you as a way of greeting, then bow back and just try to match your actions to the actions of other people. Number three, listen carefully. Use that active listening, especially the part where you clarify and make sure that you're understanding what they're saying. And number four, make an effort to be supportive. So say you're on the other end. You are in your comfort zone and you've got somebody who is visiting from another country, especially a country that's not Western. So the language is new to them, the culture and the expectations and the social norms are new to them. So if you've traveled to other cultures where the folks there have been really supportive to you, keep that in mind and try to be really supportive to your visitor as well. And then finally, try not to use slang, jargon, euphemisms. Try not to use humor except for very carefully because it can be easily misinterpreted. So for our toolkit opportunity on this topic, I want you to identify 2 things that you're going to do to improve your communication skills, either at home or at work, but ways that you're going to improve your own skills.